Okay, today we are going to be reshafting a set of irons. We're going to be going from steel shafts into graphite. So if this is something you've ever been interested in, something you've thought about doing, you're going to want to watch. Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome to the Mobile Club Maker. I'm AJ, I hope you're having a wonderful day. So in this video, we are going to be going all the way through the process of reshafting a set of irons going from steel to graphite. So we've got some Srixon irons here with some dynamic gold shafts in them. We're going to be pulling those shafts out and switching out into some Aerotech steel fiber shafts. So going from about 130 gram steel down to about 110 gram graphite shafts. We're going to go through the entire process. I'm going to show you everything from pulling the head to putting the final grip on. We're going to talk about swing weight and length and balance, all those sorts of things. So if you have any questions about going through this process, we will hopefully be able to answer them in this video. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get going. All right, so starting off, we're going to break everything down and get everything prepped and ready to go for assembly. So the first step, we're going to be pulling all these heads. Because we've got steel shafts here, we can just use our basic torch to remove these heads, twist them off by hand. We don't need to use the shaft puller for this. So we're going to start off doing that. Once we get them off, we're going to want to clean them up a little. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to start off by using my little just sort of hand wire brush to get out some of the bigger pieces of residue, old epoxy and such that are inside that hosel. Secondly, we're going to go back with some of my sandpaper dowels that are on my drill and just finish up cleaning out those hosels. Last step when we're talking about cleaning out hosels, we're going to get some acetone, put it on a Q-tip, and just basically rub that around inside the hosel, get any last bits of residue, any bits of grease or anything that may be left over in there out of those hosels to give you a good bonding surface when we put new epoxy in there. Hey, one thing before we keep going. Please go down below and hit that subscribe button and also hit that bell icon. Look, if you're interested in what we're doing here, golf club repair, golf club building, equipment, fitting, there's no better place to find more information about those subjects than right here. So please subscribe. Next step, the next thing that we're going to do before we do any shaft work, any shaft prepping, any shaft cutting, anything like that, we're going to weigh each one of these heads because we want to check that they've got a good weight progression. What is a good weight progression? Basically, if we're talking about a standard sort of length progression set of irons where you go in half-inch increments, we want about 7 grams between each head so that your 4-iron is going to be, say, around 244 grams, something like that. Then the 5-iron would be 251. Then the 6-iron would be 258. Keeps going like that in 7-gram increments. Okay, so we measured all the heads. The progression was pretty darn good. Most of them were right around that 7-gram increment going from one to the next. The only real outlier was the 9-iron, which was a little bit heavier than everything else. So then the question becomes, well, how do we want to deal with it? And I have to say, in this particular set, what I am going to do is actually increase the weight, add a little weight to all the rest of the heads, and sort of bring everything else up to where this 9-iron is. Because this 9-iron weight is really about what I consider more or less the kind of standard weight that I would want for an iron build when we're doing what we're doing here, at the length we're doing, at the shaft weight we're doing. So I think what's going to make the most sense is to add just a little bit of tip weight to the 5, 6, 7, 8, and pitching wedge so that it all matches up with this 9-iron. I also have a 4 utility iron that I'm also going to be shafting with the same shaft. And again, that 4-iron actually falls in line very closely with this 9-iron. So again, it just makes sense to sort of move everything else up just a touch to get everything in line. Okay, the next step, we're going to figure out a swing weight for this set. So for starters, I'm going to use this 4-iron that I already know and like the head weight of in general. So we're going to get the matching shaft for this 4-iron. We're going to cut it to the right length and we're going to do a dry swing weight on it. So we're going to sort of rough put it together. We're going to put a rubber band around the grip and hang the grip off it at the right spot and get a rough estimate of where the swing weight is going to be. On the swing weight scale, we also want to have it sitting back away from the stop just a little bit, again, to sort of account for that grip butt end actually filling in that space usually and making the shaft sit a little further out. So this is basically going to give you the same measurement as if you had the grip on, only you don't have to. And that's sitting right around D3. Okay, so at 248, the head weight of the 4-iron, with this shaft, a 1/2 inch over standard, 110 grams, and the grip we're going to be using, the swing weight came out right around D3, which is really perfect. Now obviously, I'm going to have a couple extra layers of tape under it, which will make it a little bit more butt heavy, but we haven't put on a ferrule or any epoxy to sort of balance that on that side. So it's going to stay pretty close to that, give or take a, you know, 1/2 a swing weight point, something like that. So I'm happy with that measurement. Next thing we're going to do, because we now know that that 248 gives us a good number, we're going to basically just try and get the rest of these numbers in line with that. Now, how are we going to add that weight? We're going to be using these little graphite shaft plugs. Now, the thing about graphite shaft plugs that you have to account for is they've got a really thick head on them, because with a steel shafted weight plug, most of that weight is down here in the body and slips up inside the shaft. But obviously with a graphite shaft, the hole is so small, you don't have a lot of room for that. And in fact, these particular ones, and basically most graphite tip weights, aren't always going to fit in graphite shafts at all. These Aerotech shafts have a very small vent hole, and you can't actually get this in here. So there's a few different ways you could deal with this. You could drill down into the tip of the shaft, widen out this hole a little bit so that this will slide down in there. But for me, because what we're basically looking at is about 3 grams each for all these, and this is 4 grams right now, I'm just going to cut this stem off and just use this base portion drop down inside the hosel. I don't need this stem part, it's unnecessary. So we're just going to cut this off using a hacksaw, drop these down, and that way we now have the added weight and we don't have to worry about this stem at all, dealing with the stem inside the graphite. Okay, so we've got our little weights now that we've cut that are basically just little cylinder weights now, 2 to 3 gram range essentially, that we can drop into the head and have them sit down there and give us that added weight that we want to get everything right in line. Now, the other thing to remember when we do this cylinder is pretty thick, and it's going to be sitting down here in the hosel, basically shortening up that hosel. So the amount that the shaft is going to fit down in here is going to be less now because this little weight's taking up more of that space. So when you're measuring and when you're going to measure to cut the shafts, make sure you measure with these little weights inside the hosel, because if they're not there, you're going to get one measurement and cut to one length when you do it raw, and then when you go to assemble it, all of a sudden the shaft's going to be sticking out further, your clubs are going to be too long because you didn't account for this little bit of extra length taking up space in that hosel. That brings up one more point, because we're not doing this with every club. Remember that 9-iron is actually a little bit heavier to start with, and we are not going to be putting one of these weight cylinders in that 9-iron. The problem then becomes if every other club has the shaft go in, say, this far, but that 9-iron, because it doesn't have one of those tip weights in it, is going to go in further, well, all of a sudden this shaft is going to play a little bit stiffer, because the more of that shaft that's inserted into the hosel, the stiffer it's going to play. So in order to get the shaft in the same position all the way through the set, we're going to use this, a little wood dowel. Basically, we're going to cut this to the same length, the same height as one of these little brass weights, but this whole thing weighs less than 1 gram, so this little tiny section of it weighs basically nothing. So we get the spacing effect, but we don't get any added weight. So that 9-iron that's already heavier will still have that shaft inserted the same depth. It'll give us the same feel of that shaft flexing, but we won't add any additional weight to it. Okay, we've got all our little tip weights and or spacers cut out. So now we can measure everything out, cut the shafts, prep the tips, and we're going to be ready to assemble. These shafts basically already have the tip section of it pre-prepped. You can see the paint has already been removed. I'm gonna run it over my little flapper wheel real quick just to rough it up a little bit more. Again, if you don't have a belt sander, or you don't feel comfortable with that, or you don't have the flapper wheel, you can just use a utility knife that you take, point the blade towards you, and scrape the paint off going away from you. So you're not cutting the graphite, you're just basically using the back of the blade to scrape it off and rotate around just like that. If you don't want to use that, you could also use some sandpaper, just some medium grit sandpaper in strips like this, and basically just take it and using that shoe shine method, back and forth, and then rotate the shaft, back and forth, rotate, and just work it till you get the paint finish off there and you get down to where there's no more paint on it. And that's all you have to do. Again, remember when we're putting these together and measuring them to cut them, make sure we put each of the little weights down in the hosel so that shaft is sitting in the right position for when it's going to actually be epoxied in and we get the right final length. Also remember, when we're doing this, you want to cut them a 1/4 inch shorter than what your final length is going to be. So if you want your 5 iron to be 38 inches, you're going to measure it out to 37 3/4 inches, because that grip cap is going to add that last little bit of length and get you right on that number. We're going to be using collared ferrules for this particular build. It's not necessary to use a collared ferrule. I found the fit was just a little bit looser than I liked, so the collared ferrule snugged it up just a tiny bit. So I'm going with that. It fits inside there. It's a good length ferrule for what I want, so we're going to go with these. Again, remember to put your little brass, or in the other case in the 9 iron, the little wood spacer in. Put that in when you go to epoxy it. I don't think it's necessary to put epoxy down in the very bottom of the hosel and then drop the weight in. I think you can just put the weight in there and then epoxy on top of that and then put the shaft in. The shaft will hold the weight in place. It's not going to rattle around. Enough epoxy will squeeze in around the little edges. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to rattle, so don't worry about that. It's also a lot easier to drop it in before you start sliming epoxy all over the place. Okay, again, installing ferrules, if they're a little bit tight and they're hard to get on, especially when you're dealing with graphite and you've got extra layers of paint to try and get them over, heating up the ferrule a little bit will make all the difference. So the easiest, safest way to do this is to get that hot bowl of water out of the microwave, not boiling, but just good and warm. Dump all the ferrules in there, let them soak in the warm water, and when you're ready to use them, pluck them out one at a time and install them right then. It makes it very easy. Because I'm being kind of lazy today, I'm just going to go and use my heat gun on just very low and just keeping it moving, keeping it a little further away, just warming this up ever so slightly to help me slide it on a little easier. Again, make sure we have our tip weight down in there so that that ferrule sits at the appropriate height and we don't install it too far and then have it hanging off when we go to actually epoxy it. This is just low heat with the heat gun for a few seconds. Give it a rotate, quarter turn, few seconds, quarter turn, few seconds, quarter turn, few seconds, quarter turn. That's it. That's all you need. Slide it on there to start. We're just going to tap it down on the ground. There we go. Again, when you're dealing with graphite and if you're tapping it down on the ground, just make sure there's some sort of padding over there. You don't want to tap the bottom of the graphite on a concrete floor, you can crack things that way. Remember, when we're working with epoxy, you don't need giant globs of epoxy, just enough to coat the surfaces. That's all you need. Just like that. Rotate as we install it. Again, these shafts, they're graphite, so they've got logos on them. They're not overly distracting or overly obvious, but still, I'm going to go ahead, and even though there's a little bit of logoing on the back, I think I would rather be looking at the logos on the back than I want the logos on the front. So we're going to do these what is, kind of on the fence. Do I want them logo up? You know what? Maybe I'm going to do these logo up. We'll do these logo up. So we're going to do logos facing up. Again, remember when you're putting these together, that little weight we've got down in there, don't let it fall out while you're working with these and all of a sudden you put one together without the actual weight in it. Again, we're going logo up with these. Wipe off the excess. Okay, now just a little bit of solvent. Make sure we get any of the excess epoxy off there. Just a couple drops, and a little bit of paper towel. Clean everything up. Make sure you don't have it on your hands. Also double check that our shafts are lined up the way we want them to be. I usually like to do a little rundown on the shaft as well, in case I inadvertently got any fingerprints on there. The epoxy is good and dry, it's hard. We can move on to the next step, which is going to be turning down these ferrules. Now, a quick little tip before we get started. I'm going to be using my sanding belt on the belt sander here, but again, remember, if you want to, if you don't have a belt sander, you can just as easily use a couple different grits of sandpaper and work it down that way. I will leave a link in the description below to a couple of videos, or at least one video where I talk about how to do this. But in this case, we're going to use the belt sander. One little tip, if you are using a belt sander, like a linen belt like we're going to be using here, a lot of these ferrules end up having this little tiny nub sticking out of them, which is basically when they pour all the plastic into the molds, where they break them off the molds. But this sticks up, and I find it often causes a little bit of issue when you're running it on the belt sander. So what I like to do usually is just sort of take a utility knife and just kind of break that little tip section off before I go and start with my turning down of the ferrules. Okay, remember, when we are turning down ferrules, we just want to use gentle pressure when we're pressing against this linen belt, and also always keep the club moving. Do not let it just sit and rest against that belt, because you will end up getting some pretty strong indentations that way. So gentle touch, keep it moving. Remember your safety glasses. Okay, last thing to do is put the grips on. We're going to be using some of these pure grips and installing them with compressed air. We're going to do 3 wraps of masking tape and then we'll be done. Okay, that's it. We just finished these Shrixon irons, pulled those dynamic gold shafts and switched them out for some graphite steel fiber shafts. Put on some pure grips also, and these clubs are ready to go. I'm excited to see what these are going to do. I have not played around very much with graphite shafted iron, so I'll be interested to see what I get out of these. We will do that in another video, but if you have any questions about anything I did, like I said, we went into a lot of detail here, so if you have any questions about any of the techniques or methods or math that I was using during this process, leave a comment down below. Or if you have questions about maybe something I didn't do, again, leave those comments down below. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, please go down below, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Please also hit that bell icon so you can be alerted when I post new videos. If you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, you can find me at AJ Golf, and I'm also on Instagram. You can find me there at Mobile Club Maker. We will see you next time. Take care.